Hello and welcome to Inside Events, a new international contemporary podcast focused on key issues in event studies. This week I'm joined by Professor Tom Fletcher from Leeds Beckett University. We're going to be talking a little bit about DEI in the context of events. Welcome, Tom. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what organisation you work for, and why you, for some time now, been interested in DEI.
Thanks for having me, Mike. So yeah, as you say, I'm Professor Tom Fletcher. I've been professor now for 53 days. So feeling very tired from all the extra high-level thinking that I now have to do as a professor, continuing to wing it. As you say, I'm based at Leeds Beckett University in the UK. I've been researching issues around diversity, equity and inclusion, social justice, specifically issues around race equality in particular since 2007 when I did a PhD around racism in cricket, which for those people that follow cricket was a bit of a slow burner. People really started to pay attention when people realised there was racism in cricket around 2 years ago, and all of a sudden the entire back catalogue of publications become of public interest, so to speak. And to be honest, I did fall into it. I didn't intend to go into researching around DEI or EDI, social justice. It wasn't on the cards. I don't know if that's the same for other people. You kind of orientate your work and then you realise that there's something interesting to say here. But I came in to do a PhD on something completely different and then emerged having done a PhD around whiteness and racism within the context of cricket. And that's something that I've taken into my academic career, into principally working around sport and sports events.
There must be something inside you, like there was with me, that was kind of maybe untapped. Like I didn't want to go into critical theory and critical studies. I kind of just followed the story. And then it just became obvious that I needed to take a critical slant on this because too many people in the context that I was looking at were being kind of screwed over in the context of urban regeneration and events, particularly big events. But was there something inside you that was always kind of a social justice warrior person?
See, I want to say yeah, but no, I don't think there was. I mean, we were talking, before the recording around, kind of working class upbringings in the north of England and all that kind of thing. And to be honest, that never really resonated with me, that I was from a working class background, because everyone was working class. The fact that I was white never occurred to me because everyone where I grew up was white. Do you know what I mean? So when I went to university and I did a kind of social science of sport degree at the University of Durham, really high quality university in the UK. We didn't talk about racism. We didn't talk about homophobia. We didn't talk about misogyny. I can't remember what we did, to be honest. Lots of physiology, I think, and kinesiology, ironically. And there was a guy called John Hewson who was a professor at Durham who moved on to Otago. Then he went to work at another university in the UK. And he absolutely blew my mind around sociology and cultural studies. And I think that kind of got my juices flowing around theory. But we never talked about social justice. I don't think that was a word in British universities in 2007, 2000. No, that will have been 2003, 2004. You didn't talk about these things. And it was only really once I'd started the PhD where I was looking around thinking, everybody looks like me. But I was 23. By the time somebody actually said, Tom, everybody who plays this sport, where you play this sport, is white. Where's everybody else? And it was at that stage that I started to look for it, but I was never taught it. And I think that was why I was so naive and just so, kind of clean shaven when you go in. So it just wasn't a thing for me. So no, I'd like to say yes, I did, but I didn't.
And it's grown. Like it's grown. Like event studies in particular. It's great to see so many critical events people and modules out there. There's a lot of teaching on it that balances the functional side of events with the critical side. And I think that in some sense, looking at UK degrees in particular, there's a really, really, really good balance. There could always be more, but there's a really good balance for such a complicated subject. Do you find that students are really, really up for the chat? And dialogue and trying to push forward these things? Or do you find that it's kind of difficult and awkward in some sense, or a mix?
See, I thought that it would be really easy because you kind of look at the current generation and think, they are, they know about, they've grown up among Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and all of these other, they've seen a black president in the White House, they've seen female prime ministers in the UK, and all of this kind of thing, and you just assume that actually they're starting to see that the wheels of change are occurring slowly, but that they also have a role to play in that. I grow quite frustrated actually within the classroom because there seems to be a kind of whimsical, dismissive nature around it. When you say you come in October and you look at the women in the room and say, just FYI, women are working for free now until the end of the year because of the gender pay gap, and they just go, like, does that not bother you? And they don't really, they're not as activistic as I thought. I don't know if that's a UK thing. I don't know if things are different, in other places in the world. Maybe it's a Leeds Beckett thing. I don't know. There are pockets of it, yeah, but you don't see that student activism, I don't think, as you do in other parts of the world.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. I find that the closest that we get is more kind of socioeconomic deprivation, making sure that marginalised, socioeconomically deprived areas kind of play a part in the city or the town and that sort of thing. But these more kind of ethereal, kind of race-related issues, women's rights issues, gay rights issues, all of these, it's kind of quite far away from home. Especially like when I was working at the University of Surrey. A lot of the students that we would have at the University of Surrey, it was a very conservative market. Yeah. Let's put it that way. And so, the social justice EDI related issues were even more distanced than where we are now. Like at the Rosen, race related issues is huge still. And there's a lot of kind of student associations. There's a lot of kind of emphasis in the classroom in terms of these particular issues. So I guess it just depends on where. It's very geographically specific, would you say?
I would say so. Where we are, we do get a fairly, I would say, certainly a very privileged, I think, intake. I don't know if that's across the board in event management, but our intakes have generally been quite privileged. They're very white. Like incredibly white, and there's still a predominance of women on it as well. So there is a certain demographic, I think, for our course of people that come specifically. And of course, in the absence of lived experience in the classroom, it's very difficult to talk about racism when there's no one from an ethnically diverse or a minority background within the room. And being a white male colleague trying to talk about racism, I think you still do have that level of ignorance within the room that kind of says, who's this person talking to me about racism? That it seems to be something that they think that you can only talk about racism if you have a lived experience of it. And so there's overcoming that barrier as well to say, well, actually, I can be a feminist. I can be a critical race, scholar. I can be an activist in areas that I don't have lived experience, because in the absence of lived experience, I've got empathy. So, I think breaking that down is still challenging, because I think many people are still quite uncomfortable dealing with this kind of language as well. They don't see the classroom as a kind of safe space necessarily, ironically, to make mistakes around language and to maybe to be a little bit ignorant and to be challenged on that, which, you try as you might, but you can't force it.
It's a great point. And it begs the question, like, what does a modern day professor do? How do they curate the program in a way that brings together these disparate interests all together to talk about them in class? It's not just sage on the stage anymore. It's really guide on the side, and curating this experience, which is even more important nowadays given the amount of online provision that's around. What is the benefit of going into a university and being part of an ecosystem? Well, the professor obviously kind of plays a massive role in curating that entire experience that you might not necessarily get online. That's probably
you'd like to hope so, Mike, wouldn't you? Because otherwise we're in deep trouble.
Deep trouble. Otherwise, we're just easily replaceable. The curation element is massive. For those that are kind of less familiar, I guess, with the concept of DEI. There's a lot of writing, including your own. A lot of people at Leeds Beckett that have been writing this space, and it's great to see you guys kind of leading that in some sense. How would you break down that concept so it's easily understandable for a first year student, for example, that might be watching this?
Yeah, I don't think that the language itself is particularly helpful at this moment in time. I think the idea of, we used to have a research centre around DEI, so diversity, equity, inclusion. Then you kind of switch to EDI, so equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think increasingly, I think what people find it easier to talk about is the social justice side of
Mm,
things. They get the idea of justice because it resonates with them as being about fairness.
mm,
And I think when you can start talking within that realm of, is it fair for this to
mm,
happen? Is it fair for certain groups to be excluded? Is it fair that some people can afford to do that and others can't? Is it fair that, blah, 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 blah.
mm,
And I think that becomes more relatable. And so I prefer to talk about EDI within that realm of justice and fairness. Um, I think within events itself, particularly if you talk to industry around social justice and fairness, they immediately turn their lens to accessibility. So for them, it is around, can everybody get access to my event, my space, my venue? I think there's a growing interest and a growing acceptance that actually everything surrounding the event and accessibility from whether, and thinking about it from an inclusivity point of view, what about inclusive marketing? What about inclusive messaging? What about the format with which I receive my information? So if I'm blind or if I'm visually impaired or I don't read particularly well, or whether I have neurodiverse needs and things like that. That recognition that we have to provide information and communication in a variety of different forms so
mm,
that it becomes accessible to lots of different people. I think that's where the industry thinks it's at. Now, obviously, as scholars on it, you're thinking more broadly around accessibility and inclusion. Now that can include anything from that sense of belonging and identity to the hospitality provision. So there's lots of ways in which we can look at it, and I don't think it's easy to say, well, that's what it is.
mm,
For me, I like to think of it, as I say, through that lens of fairness. Is what I'm providing fair? Is it accessible and is it inclusive to everybody?
mm,
Because I was
mm,
always told inclusivity, I should say, diversity follows inclusivity. If you include everybody, or if you
mm,
put things in place that include everybody, then your audience will automatically diversify because there's an
mm.
offer that speaks to them.
And do you think, Tom, do you think that through unis, we're creating leaders of the future that are that are going to make this change, that are going to be the bastions of social justice and fairness? Do you think that these are the kind of graduates that are coming out of universities more broadly, or do you think there's still a way to go?
I think they probably do come out of university being that little bit more kind of critically aware and a little bit
Mm,
more critically sensitive, I guess. I think the problem that you've got is that you still have people who lead the industry who don't necessarily think in that way. And I'm
mm,
not saying that everybody within the industry is racist and homophobic and sexist and misogynistic, but I am saying that people within industry who lead industry are used to the way things are.
mm,
And it takes a little while to, I think, to educate around what accessibility, what inclusion means. Um, and it's a fair question around. My wife, who's she's a partner in a law firm, for example, and I said to her the other day around, we were talking about positive action, and she said, no, that's illegal. I'm like, no, positive discrimination is illegal. Well,
mm,
what's the difference? So we had a chat in the kitchen, and she's going, well, blow me, I never knew that. So as an organization, she's thinking, how do I diversify my workforce? She doesn't know that she can say in a job advert, we specifically invite, applications from people from these backgrounds, because she thinks that that's a form of discrimination. And she won't be the only one out there that doesn't really know. They want to do it, but they don't necessarily know how to diversify what they do and to create more inclusive practices. And I guess that's where we need to be
mm,
available, arguably you could say better, in saying, well, we can do that for you.
mm,
We know how to do that for you. So don't despair, you know.
mm. That's really, really interesting. And I think that for example, like, I think that there's always a kind of a pragmatic middle, and I think that all my stuff's around major sports events, and these events are being vetoed left, right, and centre by cities, communities. It's the question over to what extent do major events deliver a net positive outcome for the people that host them is such a big question mark, and a lot of people have lost faith. A lot of people that have been burnt, communities that have been burnt, hosting these things and not seeing a kind of a positive return. So therefore, they take away their support in the future. There's like this erosion of trust. In some sense, this is quite an interesting thing, and not focusing on the social outcomes and the justice and the fairness angle is really hitting major events in the pocket. And I can't help but think, if we want to make massive change, striking that balance and illustrating the economic challenges that come from not following the social order and justice and fairness is a good strategy. Is that kind of part of your thinking as well, Tom?
If you think, my background and my initial route into academia was, as we say, was looking at the sport of cricket, which I guess is not going to communicate across internationally necessarily for this podcast, particularly into America. The cricket, what is that? But within the UK, for example, around 35% of people who play cricket in this country are from a South Asian, so Indian, Pakistani, Sri Lankan, Bangladeshi background. 35%. And yet, if you go to most major events, most major venues, I should say, probably up until about 5 years ago, you couldn't get halal food. You couldn't get kosher food. You couldn't get non-alcoholic beer. There weren't non-alcoholic areas or low alcohol sections of stadiums. And I was speaking to someone the other day who said all of these people that run sport think that they're really clever business people, but ultimately we've been creating a product which excludes large pockets of the spectator market. And cricket was one. A third of people were being excluded from cricket matches because no one could be bothered to figure out what was exclusive about the offer and ask, why don't you come? I think it didn't take rocket science to figure that out, really, but it was just no one's there thinking, how do I go about doing this and how do we implement these changes? So, I think ultimately, you need to have that kind of willingness to learn, don't you, to challenge the status quo. And the way I've always looked at it is to think, not rather than thinking about being inclusive and saying, well, there's nothing that we do that is exclusive. We're open to everybody. Is to think, let's go beyond it. Let's be anti-racist. Let's be anti-misogynistic. Let's be anti-homophobic. And saying, well, let's be more active in what we're putting forward to say, this is, we're welcoming to all because look at this, what we're doing, rather than just assuming that if we do it, then people will come.
Is there a sense as well that they don't want to be inclusive? Isn't there a group of people inside cricket that want to keep cricket the way it is, like it always has been, and that they don't want to see change and see different faces at the events? Is there any of that?
Well, the new independent national inquiry would say that. Yeah, that basically said cricketers overseen and the administrators have overseen a sport which is racist, homophobic, misogynistic, basically the worst place to be in the world. And that people are quite happy for it to be like that and that they will resist change at all, at every opportunity. I don't think the reality is like that. I don't think cricket's clearly not on its own in this respect. I don't think sports are ever inherently racist or homophobic or something. They're effectively cultural phenomena, aren't they? They've been created in the ilk of the people that, perpetuate this cycle. What it relies upon or needs is for people to challenge that status quo and for there be a willingness to listen to that challenge and that resistance. And I think the days are gone now where you could say, oh, well, DEI, social justice is just the right thing to do. I think people have seen beyond that to say, I'm sick of being told it's just the right thing. You have to do it like this because it makes business sense. It's going to make you money. It's going to diversify your markets. It's going to make you more appealing to sponsors. When you start speaking in that language, these organizations actually start to perk up and go, oh, right. Rather than doing it because they should do it, because they believe it's the right thing to do. And I think there's still a bit of work to do there around convincing people to say you can be commercially inclusive and successful, but you can also not be exploitative at the same time. They're not one and they're not mutually exclusive, are they? And your experience with major events would say that.
Oh, it's exactly the same. It's so strange, how watching major events, trying to appeal to an international market, but yet really, really force people to just go to the sports events and venues and not engage with the cities, for example, and therefore shooting themselves in the foot that they're not encouraging people to spend locally and leave a better legacy, a lasting legacy in local supply chains, local businesses, local residencies, and actively design major event cities in a way that offer express lines, train lines, and buses to and from venues, from hotel to venue, venue to venue, to make sure that people efficiently get round and shut off subways or
Yeah,
shut off train lines that purposefully mean people can't go in to certain inner city districts and spend their money and engage with, local people, local businesses, and that sort of, purposefully design an entire system that forces them to spend in Coca-Cola. And it's so funny. It's this modus operandi that is just drilled into people. It's all about crowd management. Get them in, get them out. Don't let anyone die, and we're good. And it forgets about the entire purpose of what the event's about. But then we wrote a paper recently in tourism management, and it came out about 2 months ago, and it was called leveraging major events to tackle disability issues, and for accessibility, tackle attitudes and disability issues for people with disabilities, and we tracked essentially over kind of 70 years the fact that since Stoke Mandeville Games, that birthed the kind of Paralympic movement. The Paralympic Commission had this symbiotic relationship between the event, what it was doing, and then the UN. And then that was affecting the accords on accessibility, inclusivity, diversity. And, it was illustrating how major sports events are this huge northern star that reorientate. They act as microcosms in society. That's society's like that because that's how it manifested support for disabled people with disabilities. And it's quite interesting how they also serve as this big northern star if you look really longitudinally at events and try to capture that is I think important as well. Rome's not built in a day, and these things do reorientate us in lots of ways, and it's trying to kind of work out how they do that, I guess, in some sense. Is that
we're doing it? Yeah, we're doing a similar thing with a government funded project around online hate within the context of football, for example, and we're using men's and women's European football championships as the sparkler, I guess, for incidences of online abuse or online hate. And we've gone back to effectively the birth of Twitter in, I don't know, 2007 or whenever it was, and looked at, and we've collected data around every single men's and women's European championships from then until 2022, looking at how hate kind of peaks and troughs around general elections, presidential elections, Brexit for the UK, and other things, to see how this hate kind of coalesces around these different events, some of which are sporting, some of which are social and cultural. And unsurprisingly, it does. It's like hate's always there, and then whoop, and peaks, and it does peak, and then it'll drop again. And sports events are a prime example of that. In terms of, someone misses a penalty, right, we're going to hound you. You scored a goal against my fantasy football team. You scored the winning goal against a team that stopped me winning $2,000 in some sort of accumulator through the bookies and all that kind of stuff. And it's absolutely fascinating how, from our perspective, just how people are dehumanized online and how that dehumanization plays out through the context of major sporting events.
Can't help but think that those discursive spaces, whether it's at the venue where people are just chanting racial slurs, or online, these should be spots whereby people are just completely eradicated, unable to participate in going to games in the future. I feel like there should be more security and safety around spotting people who are doing this, banning them forever. And it needs to be a really, really harsh penalty. It's so bad that I would say that, at least a year ban or two ban. But you hear about still such unsavory behavior going on in venues online, all these, but yet there's never really that much ramification. Some people are taught a lesson, but it's just still not. Is that the vibe that you still get from kind of sports spaces, whether that's
Yeah,
maybe
yeah,
online or whether it's physical?
yeah. Not least. I mean, the thing that makes our study slightly different to anything that's come before it is that we do actually have the primary data with the kind of recipients of hate as well. So we have been doing plenty of work with professional footballers, for example, or sports journalists that write about these kinds of things and then get hounded because of their perspective on sport washing and all of these other things. Um, I was talking to a former Premier League player over the weekend actually, and he said just from being transferred from one club to the next, he would wake up to, I don't know, 100, 150 direct messages, which were all just direct death threats because they were leaving the club. And you're like, so what happened? Well, nothing happened. Well, why did nothing happen? What did you do about it? Well, I just ignored it. Okay, so at that point, you start to think, well, you shouldn't have to kind of suffer alone and suffer in silence.
Mm.
Why didn't you report it? Well, there wasn't really a mechanism in place, or you know, no confidence in the social media companies to follow it up, or no confidence in the police to follow it up, and all of these. So there's this kind of cycle that perpetuates of people just being vile
Yeah,
online, targeting people because they're not people to them. They're just a social media account. Then
yeah,
receiving it and saying, well, that's part and parcel of my job,
yeah,
doing
yeah. It
nothing about
normalizes.
it, and then it just keeps going. It just keeps going and going.
That's really interesting. Really interesting. And how do you? I think it's like anything like this. One data point whereby if they were to report that person and then suddenly that person has been reported 5 times, suddenly there's a case from the police to actually do something about it. But without the data point of how do you build a case against people to then eject them or fine them or
By
really
all accounts,
interesting.
the biggest problem, by all accounts, is actually making the distinction between something being abusive, which is horrible, but you don't really do anything about it, and something being a hate crime. So then you can start to um, invoke some sort of legal action.
Mm,
And by all accounts, for it to be a hate crime, you've got to incite others to follow you.
mm,
So me making an individual death threat or calling somebody a racist name is not a hate crime. So nothing happens because, but as soon as you tag other people in and encourage people to do the same
mm.
and say, we're all coming for you and get other people to like it and retweet it and all that kind of stuff, until that happens, nobody does anything.
Essentially, can't do anything about it.
No,
These individual.
no, because the only thing you can do is maybe throw you off social media or something. So you just create another account and come back again.
What? So what if they said that in the stadium? They said, "All right, I'm gonna, you missed that penalty. I'm gonna kill. When I get you, when I see you out of here, I'm gonna kill you." Yeah, is that not? Is that not something that violates any kind of
Well,
law, or is it
and
something that you can't be in prison for? Or
I think in realistically, probably nothing happens with that because let's be honest, is anybody paid enough in the stadium to call you out on that? The
mm,
stewards aren't. It's the stewards' jobs, isn't it,
mm,
to be responsible for that? In the UK, they're paid minimum wage, probably
mm,
less than minimum wage
mm, mm,
once the agencies have taken their cut from their wages. So, would you intervene
mm,
with some, I don't know, drunken louts
mm,
calling out death threats and being
mm,
racist? Would
mm.
you intervene?
Yeah,
I'm not sure if I would have done if I was a
no,
20-year-old
no.
old student on minimum wage.
Yeah,
So
yeah, it's true.
that's why the
Especially
stadiums
over.
continue to be a melting pot of this rubbish, really.
Yeah, yeah. Well, maybe the role of AI technology integration into stadiums, to kind of root this sort of stuff out. Maybe is that part of the solution, Tom?
I think it probably is. I think in the first instance, though, I'd like to see more citizen activism in that respect. I think make reporting it easier and encourage more people to do it. So I think a big part of our work is around educating the spectators as well to say, well, you do have a role to play here. Don't just
Mm,
ignore it. Just because you're not actively being racist or homophobic doesn't mean that
mm,
doesn't mean that you're not part of the problem. Ultimately, solving the problem is it comes with that activism and that degree of citizenship and confidence to call people out. Now, if you can't call people out physically and to kind of say, I don't think what you're saying is right, then you have to create mechanisms in order to report it and have confidence that if you do report it, something's going to happen.
Mm.
And we've seen that, again, I keep going back to the context of cricket, mainly because, I think because cricket has been under the spotlight in this country for the last couple of years, the governing bodies and the clubs are doing a hell of a lot of work to change their imagery. And, you can go to venues now where it'll just have a little QR code at the back of the seat. You scan that and it will take you through to the reporting service to report antisocial or discriminatory behaviour, for example. Now, as soon as you kind of take those barriers away to doing it, then it becomes easier. No one wants to get up in the middle of a contest and go and speak to the steward and start pointing at somebody who's doing something inappropriate, because that outs you as the person who's done it, and that no one wants to do that. So if you can do it inconspicuously, and create those mechanisms which are a bit more streamlined, then people will do it. But again, you've just got to have the nouns to go and implement that.
Yeah. Well, these technologies are fairly straightforward to implement when it comes to, for example, QR technologies and various stuff like that. There's some kind of quick wins that can be easily transported from one context to another. And I guess that begs the question of, the role of academics in all of this for kind of synthesizing, these kind of positive, progressive practices and suggesting ways forward. But I suspect that what's the situation? They either don't know how to do anything about it, or they do know how to do something about it and have decided not to do anything about it. And I suspect that is probably the case, because if you and I know how to install these things and we're not deeply rooted in the sports industry, the practice of it, you would expect that they would, given that they're on the ground. But it's very interesting why some people act and some people don't, and why, what holds them back. But Tom, I've got to shoot to work. But thank you so much for coming on Inside Events. We'll definitely add some of the work that you've done and others have done underneath the podcast. So if anyone wants to follow it up, then they can do. And hopefully we can have a panel in some sense, maybe talking specifically about the race-related issues in maybe kind of America and the UK, to kind of do some kind of comparisons, and maybe around the world as well, and have a bit of a follow-up if you'd be up for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a PhD student who was going to do exactly that and struggled for funding. So if you can figure out a way of getting her some funding, she was amazing.
Okay. That's a conversation.
Just put that out there. Or if anybody listening has some funding that would like to fund a student to do the PhD, then I have a perfect one.
Yeah. Okay. Well, get in touch with Tom. If we'll put your email address at the bottom. The plea. Cool. Thank you so much, Tom. And hopefully we'll have you again.